I always thought I'd see it coming. If you asked me what I feared most in life, I would have said failure, at least until I found those messages. Now I know failure isn't what keeps a man up at night. It's betrayal, the kind that creeps in silently, slowly suffocating every ounce of trust you once had for the person lying next to you. I wasn't looking for proof. Not that day. I didn't need to. Emily was still asleep beside me, tangled in the sheets, breathing softly, like everything in our world was perfectly normal. But it wasn't. Something had shifted between us, like a fault line I hadn't noticed before, but now the crack was widening, threatening to swallow me whole. It started a few weeks ago, just small things, a sudden need to work late, more time spent on her phone, the way she'd pull it closer when I glanced over. I should have asked then, should have said something, but I was stuck in my own head, struggling to put words on paper, drowning in my own failure. My last book had flopped, and every passing day, the next one felt further out of reach. I don't know why I reached for her phone that morning. It was an impulse, maybe, driven by some quiet voice inside me that whispered, "Something is wrong." I didn't expect to find anything. I wasn't prepared for what I did. The texts were still open. James. The name hit me like a punch to the gut. James, the critic who tore my last book to shreds. James, the man who called me a writer on the decline. James, the man who was now apparently fucking my wife. I sat there, staring at the screen, my hands shaking, my breath catching in my throat. The messages were clear, explicit, no room for interpretation. Last night was amazing. I can't stop thinking about you. His words, not hers, but her reply followed quickly. Me neither. Same time next week? I put the phone down, gently, like it might explode. I couldn't feel anything at first. My mind went blank, my heart slowed, and for a moment I thought maybe I hadn't seen it. Maybe this was some terrible dream, some nightmare I'd wake up from. But there she was, sleeping peacefully beside me, completely unaware that her entire life had just unraveled in my head. I didn't wake her. I couldn't. I wasn't ready to face the lies, the excuses, the inevitable tears. Instead, I got up quietly, left the room, and headed straight to my office. The air felt too thick, the silence too loud. I sat at my desk and stared at the blank screen in front of me, my mind racing through the past few months, trying to pinpoint when it all started. I should have seen it coming. Should have noticed the way she smiled more when she looked at her phone, the way she brushed off my attempts to talk about our future. But I didn't. I was too wrapped up in my own failures to notice hers. For hours, I sat there, numb, replaying the messages in my mind. The anger came in waves, followed by disbelief, and finally, a cold, hard clarity. This wasn't just an affair. It was betrayal on a level I couldn't have imagined. She wasn't just cheating with some stranger. She was cheating with the one man who had made it his mission to destroy my career. The irony wasn't lost on me. James had taken everything from me, my confidence, my reputation, and now my wife. But as the hours passed, something else started to creep in alongside the anger. A strange, twisted sense of opportunity. I'd been searching for the spark, the inspiration to write again. And now, I had it. I opened a new document on my computer, my fingers hovering over the keys. I didn't know exactly what I was going to write, but I knew one thing. This story wasn't just going to be about them. It was going to be about me, about the man left behind, the man who had nothing left to lose. I started typing, the words flowing faster than they had in months. Every detail of their affair bled onto the page, but not as a confession, not as a diary. No, this was fiction. I was going to turn their betrayal into my masterpiece. The protagonist, a man much like me, but sharper, more ruthless, would uncover the truth. He wouldn't confront his cheating wife outright. Instead, he'd play a long game, using the affair as leverage to manipulate her, to twist her guilt and lies into his own advantage. It wouldn't be a love story. It would be a story about power, about revenge, about reclaiming control in a life that had spun wildly off course. As I wrote, the bitterness I felt transformed into something more manageable, something I could hold in my hands and shape to my will. The numbness faded, replaced by a strange sense of satisfaction. Every keystroke was a quiet act of revenge, a way to take back some of the dignity they had stolen from me. Hours passed. The sun had risen, casting light through the cracks in the blinds. I could hear Emily moving around upstairs, the soft padding of her feet as she started her day, completely unaware of the storm brewing below. When I finally stopped, I had written 10 pages. They weren't perfect, but they were raw, real. I sat back in my chair, my hands shaking again, but this time with adrenaline, not fear. I knew I had something here, something that could pull me out of the pit I'd been sinking into. Emily called my name from the kitchen. I could hear her making coffee, humming softly to herself. For a brief moment, I wondered how many more days we'd go on like this. Her lying, me pretending not to know. But the truth was I didn't care. Not right now. This story, this book, was more important. It was my way out. I saved the document, closed my laptop, and headed upstairs, slipping back into the role of the oblivious husband. The day would go on like any other, but I wasn't the same. I had a plan now, a way to take control of the narrative. As I walked into the kitchen, Emily looked up and smiled, handing me a cup of coffee as if nothing had changed. And for her, maybe nothing had. But for me, everything was different. The story had begun. The days that followed felt like I was living in two separate realities. In one, I was the dutiful husband, smiling at Emily over breakfast, nodding along as she told me about her plans for the day. We still went to bed together, shared quiet conversations, and even laughed at old memories like nothing had changed. But in the other reality, the one I kept hidden, I was the writer, furiously pouring out every detail of her betrayal into my manuscript, shaping it into something dark and compelling. The more I wrote, the more I realized that this wasn't just a story about her infidelity. It was about me, about how I had let my life slip away, about how I had allowed people like James to tear me down, about how I had stopped fighting for what I wanted. The protagonist of my novel wasn't just uncovering an affair. He was using it as a way to regain control, to find power in a world that had taken it from him. And that's what I was doing too. Every time I sat down at my computer, I felt a little more in control of my life, a little less like the victim in this story. I didn't need to confront Emily or James. I didn't need to fight with her, to beg her to stay, or to explain why she did it. I didn't need any of that, because I had this. I had my words, and in those words, I was the one who called the shots. It was strange how the writing started to bleed into my day-to-day life. At first, I kept the two separate. The time I spent with Emily was just that, time with her. But as the story developed, I found myself thinking about it all the time. I'd be sitting across from her at dinner, listening to her talk about her job or something she'd read, and in the back of my mind, I was plotting the next chapter. Even when she smiled at me, I couldn't stop the cold, calculating thoughts from creeping in. Did she know that I knew? Did she suspect? Or was she really that good at lying, that good at pretending everything was fine while she sneaked around behind my back with James? I'd watch her face, searching for any sign of guilt, any flicker of remorse. But there was nothing. She was flawless in her deception. It only fueled my writing more. The protagonist in my story, much like me, never confronts his wife directly. He doesn't need to. Instead, he starts to manipulate her, to twist their conversations, their shared life, into something that serves him. He creates scenarios where she unknowingly confesses her guilt, where her lies unravel before her eyes, all while he remains calm, in control. I began to play the same game. Subtle at first, slight changes in our routine, small tests to see how far I could push her without her noticing. I'd ask about her day, about her plans, and watch how she'd weave the lies, adding new layers each time. I'd make comments about James, wondering aloud if he was still writing reviews, seeing if her reaction would betray her. But Emily was a master at this. She never flinched, never gave me anything to latch onto. It was like she had perfected the art of compartmentalization, separating her affair from our marriage so completely that I almost believed it wasn't real. Almost. Then one night, after she had gone to bed, I opened her phone again. It wasn't hard. She trusted me enough not to change her password, or maybe she thought I'd never be bold enough to check again. Either way, it was easy to slip back into that world of secrets. This time, there were new messages, plans for a weekend getaway with James. "We could say it's a work trip," she wrote. "Dom won't suspect a thing." It hit me like a punch to the gut, but I didn't let the pain linger. Instead, I filed it away, another piece of the puzzle for my book. My protagonist would have to deal with this too. He'd find out about his wife's plans, But instead of confronting her, he'd let her go. He'd let her dig herself deeper, all while preparing for the moment when he'd pull the rug out from under her. The story was taking on a life of its own, and I couldn't stop it. Every night, after Emily fell asleep, I'd stay up late, writing until my fingers ached. The manuscript was growing, and with every new chapter, I felt like I was getting closer to something bigger than just revenge. This story was my way out, my way of reclaiming the power I had lost. But there was something else happening too, something I didn't expect. The more I wrote, the more I started to see Emily differently. Not just as the villain in this narrative, but as a person, a flawed, complicated person who had made a terrible mistake. I'd think about the early days of our relationship, back when everything was easy and exciting, before life got messy and before I let my failures define me. I'd think about the way we used to laugh together, the way she'd look at me with so much trust and love. And I'd wonder, was it really all her fault? Hadn't I played a part in this too? I'd been so consumed by my work, by my need to prove myself as a writer, that I hadn't noticed when she started drifting away. I hadn't seen the signs that she was unhappy, that she was searching for something I wasn't giving her. It didn't excuse what she had done, but it made me question whether I was really the hero in this story or just another flawed character trying to find his way through the mess we'd both created. I didn't know how to feel about that. Some nights, I'd write with a fury, determined to paint her as the villain, to make her pay for what she'd done. But other nights, I'd write scenes that were softer, more reflective, where my protagonist grappled with his own guilt, his own role in the collapse of his marriage. It was a strange place to be, caught between revenge and understanding, between anger and forgiveness, and it was starting to wear on me. One morning, as I sat across from Emily at breakfast, I realized I hadn't slept more than a few hours in days. My mind was racing constantly, flipping between the reality of our life and the story I was crafting. It was getting harder to keep them separate. She noticed. "You okay?" she asked, looking at me with those concerned eyes that, months ago, would have melted me. "You've been really quiet lately." I shrugged, forcing a smile. "Just focused on the book." "Oh." She smiled, her face lighting up the way it always did when I mentioned my writing. "That's great. I've missed seeing you so into it." The irony almost made me laugh. She had no idea that the book she was so supportive of was about her, about us, about the lies she was telling every day. But I didn't laugh. Instead, I nodded and sipped my coffee, my mind already drifting back to the next chapter. That night, as I sat down at my desk again, I realized something had changed. The story wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about something deeper, something more personal, and I wasn't sure if I was ready to face where it was taking me. The first time I started to feel it, the pull back toward Emily, it hit me like a wave of confusion. I was writing late one night, as usual, diving deep into the next chapter of my manuscript. The protagonist, still unnamed in my mind but clearly modeled after me, had reached the point where he was just about to strike. His wife was teetering on the edge of discovery, blissfully unaware of the intricate trap he had set for her. But as I wrote, something strange happened. Instead of focusing on his cold, calculated moves, I found myself writing something softer. In the scene, he wasn't ready to pull the trigger just yet. He hesitated. I wasn't sure why I was making him do it. My plan had always been for him to go through with it, to expose her, to take his revenge. But instead, I let him pause, watching her from the shadows as she slept, wondering how things had come to this. And that's when it hit me. That hesitation. It wasn't just the characters, it was mine. I sat back in my chair, staring at the words on the screen, trying to figure out why. Why was I holding back? Why wasn't I ready to let him confront her, to make her pay? The answer, when it came, was one I didn't like. I wasn't ready because I was starting to feel something I hadn't expected. Pity. Or maybe it was something else. Maybe it was understanding. The more I wrote about her, about him, about their broken marriage, the more I saw pieces of us in them. And the more I saw those pieces, the harder it became to separate the characters from the reality of our life. It wasn't just that I understood why my protagonist was hesitating. It was that I was starting to understand Emily, too. It started small at first, just little things, memories, mostly. like the way she used to look at me when we were first dating, that sparkle in her eye that made me feel like the only person in the world, or the way she'd wake me up on Saturday mornings with the smell of coffee and pancakes, dancing around the kitchen in her pajamas like she didn't have a care in the world. Those memories, the good ones, had been buried under the weight of everything that had happened. But as I wrote, they started to resurface, unbidden, intruding on the narrative I was trying to craft. I'd be in the middle of a scene, detailing the latest betrayal, when suddenly, I'd remember our first anniversary, the way she'd surprised me with a weekend trip to the mountains, just the two of us. No phones, no distractions. For a while, I pushed those memories aside, forced myself to stay focused on the present, on what she was doing now, not what she had done in the past. But it wasn't easy. The more I wrote, the harder it became to ignore the fact that we hadn't always been like this. There was a time when things were good, better than good, even. There was a time when I loved her more than anything in the world. And that's when the doubts started creeping in. What if I had done things differently? What if I had noticed sooner, before it was too late, that she was drifting away? What if I had fought harder to keep us together instead of getting lost in my work, in my failures? Was this really all her fault, or had I played a part in it too? I didn't want to think about those questions. It was easier to focus on the anger, on the betrayal, on the way she had lied to me, again and again. But those questions kept coming back, gnawing at the edges of my mind, making it harder and harder to write the story the way I had originally planned. And then there was the other thing. The thing I hadn't expected at all. As the writing started to change, so did the way I felt about her. In the beginning, I was cold, distant, detached. I could sit across from her at dinner, listening to her talk about her day, and feel nothing but disgust. But now, something had shifted. I started paying more attention, not just to what she was saying, but to how she was saying it. I started noticing little things, like the way her smile never quite reached her eyes anymore, or the way she'd bite her lip when she thought I wasn't looking, like she was holding something back. For the first time in months, I started to wonder if she was happy, not just with me, but with her life. I'd always assumed the affair was her way of escaping boredom, or maybe it was some twisted revenge for all the time I'd spent neglecting her while I chased my writing dreams. But now, I wasn't so sure. Maybe she was just as lost as I was. I didn't know how to feel about that realization. Part of me wanted to stay angry, to hold on to the rage and the bitterness that had fueled me for so long. But another part of me, one that was growing louder with each passing day, wanted to understand. One night, after she had gone to bed, I sat down at my desk and opened the manuscript again. But this time, I didn't start writing right away. Instead, I sat there, staring at the blinking cursor, trying to figure out what came next. In the story, my protagonist had reached the same point I had. He knew about the affair, he had all the pieces in place, but he couldn't bring himself to act. Not yet. Something was holding him back, something he couldn't quite name. And that's when it hit me. It wasn't just about revenge anymore. It wasn't even about the affair. It was about them, about their marriage, about everything they had lost, and everything they still might be able to save. I started typing, but this time the words came slower. In the new chapter, my protagonist confronts his wife, not with anger, not with accusations, but with a question. Why? That's all he says, just one word. In the story, she doesn't answer right away. She hesitates, unsure of what he's asking. But he presses on, not letting her off the hook. Why did it happen? Why did you need him when you had me? It's a question I hadn't asked Emily yet, not out loud, but I realized it was the one question I needed to ask more than anything, because the answer would determine everything. If it was just about the excitement, the thrill of doing something forbidden, then there was nothing left to save. But if it was more than that, if it was because she felt something was missing, something I hadn't seen, then maybe, just maybe, there was a way forward. I didn't know if I was ready to ask her that question. I wasn't sure if I was ready for the answer. But I knew one thing for sure. I couldn't keep going the way I was. I couldn't keep pretending that the story I was writing was just fiction, that it had nothing to do with me. It had everything to do with me. The next morning, I woke up early, before Emily, and sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee, thinking about what I would say. I'd imagined this moment 1,000 times, how I'd confront her, how I'd reveal that I knew everything, how I'd make her feel the same pain she had caused me. But now that it was here, I didn't feel angry. I just felt tired. Tired of the lies, tired of the pretending, tired of holding everything in. When she came downstairs, still half asleep, I didn't wait for her to sit down. I just looked at her, really looked at her, and said the words I had been avoiding for months. "Why, Emily?" Her eyes widened, and for the first time in a long time, I saw something real in her expression. Fear, guilt, and something else, something that looked an awful lot like relief. Emily stood frozen at the foot of the stairs, her hands still gripping the banister as if she needed to hold on to something to keep from falling. Her eyes locked with mine, wide and searching, like she was trying to figure out if this was real, if I really knew. For a moment, the kitchen was completely silent, save for the faint ticking of the clock on the wall. I could see the thoughts racing behind her eyes. Should she lie? Should she pretend everything was fine? Or should she finally tell me the truth? I didn't repeat the question. I just waited, the tension between us growing thicker with every second that passed. I could see her trying to compose herself, her face going blank, as if she was preparing to give some carefully rehearsed answer. But then she faltered. The mask she'd been wearing for months cracked, just for a second, but it was enough. I could see the guilt, the shame, and the exhaustion written all over her face. She let go of the banister and slowly walked toward me, her steps hesitant, like she wasn't sure what was going to happen next. When she sat down across from me at the kitchen table, she avoided my gaze, staring down at her hands instead. Her fingers twisted together in her lap, restless and nervous, a stark contrast to the calm, composed woman I'd been living with for the past few months. For what felt like an eternity, neither of us spoke. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, the weight of everything that had been left unsaid between us bearing down on me. I wanted to break the silence, to say something, but I didn't know what. Part of me still wanted to lash out, to accuse her, to make her feel the same hurt I had been carrying. But another part of me just wanted the truth. I wanted to understand why this had happened, why we had ended up here. Finally, she broke the silence. "I don't know what to say," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I never meant for it to get this far." I felt a bitter laugh rise in my throat, but I swallowed it down. I wasn't interested in hearing her excuses. I needed more than that. "How long?" I asked, my voice cold, detached. I wasn't sure if I really wanted to know, but I had to ask. She took a deep breath, still staring down at her hands. "A few months," she admitted, her voice shaky. I didn't plan for it to happen. It just did." I nodded, even though the words felt like knives twisting in my gut. A few months. That meant the affair had started right around the time I had been at my lowest, when I was struggling to finish the book, when I was questioning everything about my life, my career, my marriage. She had been sneaking off with James while I had been drowning in self-doubt, too wrapped up in my own misery to notice. I wanted to ask her why. I wanted to demand an explanation for how she could do this to me, to us, but the words stuck in my throat. Instead, I asked the only question that mattered. "Do you love him?" Emily flinched at the question, her eyes finally lifting to meet mine. She looked like she had been caught off guard, like she hadn't expected me to ask that. For a moment, she hesitated, as if she was searching for the right answer. But then she shook her head, her eyes filling with tears. "No," she whispered. "No, I don't love him. I never did." Her words hung in the air between us, and for a moment, I wasn't sure if I believed her. But the look on her face, the raw vulnerability in her eyes, told me that she was telling the truth. She didn't love him. But that didn't make it any easier to swallow. "Then why?" I asked, my voice cracking despite my best efforts to keep it steady. "Why him? Why now?" Emily wiped at her eyes, her fingers trembling as she tried to compose herself. She let out a shaky breath, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know. I wish I could tell you, but I don't even know how it happened. It felt like everything between us had changed, like we were drifting apart and I didn't know how to stop it." I stared at her, the words sinking in. Deep down, I knew she was right. Things between us had changed long before James came into the picture. We had been drifting apart for months, maybe even years, and neither of us had done anything to fix it. I had been so focused on my failures, so consumed by the pressure of my career, that I hadn't noticed her slipping away. And by the time I had, it was already too late. "That's not an excuse," I said quietly but firmly. "You could have talked to me. You could have told me how you were feeling instead of doing this." Emily nodded, her shoulders slumping as if the weight of her guilt was finally catching up to her. "I know," she whispered. "I should have. But I was scared. I didn't know how to tell you without making things worse." The anger I had been holding on to for so long flared up again, hot and sharp. "So you thought sleeping with him would make things better?" I asked, my voice rising despite myself. She flinched at the accusation, her tears falling freely now. "No," she choked out. "I wasn't thinking. I wasn't trying to hurt you. I was just lost. Lost." That word stuck with me, echoing in my mind long after she had said it. It was the same word I had been using to describe myself for months, lost in my work, lost in my failures, lost in my own head. Maybe we were both lost, in our own ways. But that didn't change the fact that she had betrayed me. It didn't change the fact that everything between us was broken. I stood up from the table, the weight of the conversation pressing down on me like a heavy stone. "I need some air," I muttered, not looking at her as I turned to leave the kitchen. Emily didn't try to stop me. She just sat there, her head bowed, her shoulders shaking as she cried silently into her hands. I stepped outside, the cool morning air hitting my face like a shock to the system. I took a deep breath, trying to clear my head, but the weight of everything that had just been said still lingered in the air around me. I walked down the steps and onto the street, my feet moving automatically without any real destination in mind. I just needed to get away, to think. I wandered for what felt like hours, my mind racing through everything that had just happened. I had finally gotten the truth out of her, but it hadn't brought me any relief. If anything, I felt worse. I had thought that once I confronted her, once I knew the truth, I'd be able to make sense of it all. But the truth didn't make it any easier to understand. It didn't make the pain go away. Eventually, I found myself sitting on a park bench, staring out at the empty playground in front of me. The swings creaked in the breeze, the sound eerily quiet in the early morning light. I closed my eyes, letting the sounds of the world around me fade into the background as I tried to make sense of the mess my life had become. I didn't know what to do next. Part of me wanted to walk away, to leave Emily and the affair behind and start over somewhere else. But another part of me, one I wasn't sure I fully understood, wanted to stay. Despite everything, despite the lies and the betrayal, there was still something between us. Something worth fighting for. But was it enough? I didn't have the answer. Not yet. All I knew was that things couldn't go back to the way they were. Too much had changed. Too much had been broken. If we were going to move forward, if there was any chance of saving what was left of our marriage, it would take more than just an apology. It would take time and effort and honesty, things we hadn't been giving each other for a long time. I sat there for a long time, lost in thought, until the sound of footsteps on the pavement behind me broke through my reverie. I turned to see Emily walking toward me, her eyes red and puffy from crying, but her expression determined. "I don't want to lose you," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I know I messed up. I know I hurt you, but I'm willing to do whatever it takes to fix this, if you'll let me." I stared at her, my mind racing with conflicting emotions. I didn't know if I could trust her again. I didn't know if I was ready to forgive her. But as I looked into her eyes, I realized that, deep down, a part of me still loved her. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough to start with. Emily's words hung in the air between us, heavy and uncertain. "I don't want to lose you." It was the first time she had said something that made me feel anything other than anger or resentment. I sat there on that park bench, looking at her, trying to figure out if I still wanted to hold on to what we had or if it was time to let go. The thing was, despite everything, there was a part of me that didn't want to lose her either. I wasn't sure if it was love or habit or just fear of being alone, but the thought of walking away didn't feel as satisfying as it should have. I thought revenge would feel good, like it would give me closure. But sitting here, looking at Emily's tear-streaked face, I I realized that what I wanted wasn't revenge. I wanted answers. I wanted to know how the hell we got here, and if there was any way back. I don't know, I finally said, my voice hoarse. I don't know if I can fix this. I don't even know where to start. Emily nodded, biting her lip like she was trying to hold back more tears. I understand, and I don't expect you to forgive me right away, but I'm here, Dom. I'm still here, and I'm willing to try if you are. I stared down at the ground, the weight of her words pressing down on me. Could I really try? Could I let go of the anger and the betrayal long enough to even begin to fix this? I wasn't sure, but I knew that doing nothing wasn't an option. If we didn't at least try, we'd both be living with ghosts, haunted by what could have been. And if we failed, if we couldn't find a way back, at least we'd know we gave it a shot. We need to talk, I said, more to myself than to her. Really talk, not just about the affair, about everything. Emily sat down next to me, leaving a few inches of space between us, like she wasn't sure if she was allowed to be close to me anymore. Okay, she said softly. I'm ready. I wasn't sure if I was, but I knew it had to start somewhere. We walked back to the house in silence, the weight of everything unsaid hanging between us like a thick fog. Once we were inside, I made us both coffee. It felt strange, falling into old routines after everything that had happened, but the normalcy of it was comforting. We sat at the kitchen table, the same place where I'd first confronted her, and for the first time in months, we really talked. Emily told me about how she'd felt invisible, like I'd been slipping away from her long before the affair started. She told me how she'd tried to reach out, tried to get my attention, but I'd always been too distracted by my work, too consumed by my own failures to see what was happening right in front of me. I listened, really listened, and for the first time, I understood just how much I had neglected her. I had been so focused on my career, on proving myself as a writer, that I hadn't even noticed that my marriage was falling apart. That didn't make what she'd done okay. I told her that. I wasn't ready to forgive her, and I wasn't sure if I ever would be. But at least now, I could see how we had both played a part in the mess we found ourselves in. Emily apologized, really apologized for the affair. She didn't try to make excuses, didn't try to downplay it. She owned up to it, admitted that she'd made a terrible mistake, and told me how ashamed she felt. I could see the guilt in her eyes, the regret weighing heavy on her shoulders, and I believed her. She was sorry. But I wasn't sure if sorry was enough. I didn't tell her about the book. Not yet. That was something I still needed to figure out on my own. The book had been my way of processing everything, my way of getting through the pain, but now that things were starting to shift, I wasn't sure what role it played anymore. Would finishing the book help me heal, or would it just drag me back into the anger I was trying to let go of? As the conversation went on, something strange happened. The more we talked, the more I started to see the woman I'd fallen in love with all those years ago. She wasn't just the woman who had betrayed me. She was also the woman who had been by my side through some of the hardest times of my life. She was the woman who had believed in me when I didn't believe in myself, who had supported me even when I was too wrapped up in my own misery to appreciate it. But was that enough? Could I look past what she had done? Could I trust her again? I didn't have the answers, but I knew that I wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. We spent the rest of the day talking, going over everything we had ignored for so long. It wasn't easy. There were moments when I felt the anger bubbling up again, moments when I wanted to walk away, to tell her that it was over. But I didn't. I stayed, and so did she. That night, we slept in the same bed, but we didn't touch. It was strange, lying next to her after everything that had come out, but at least it didn't feel like we were strangers anymore. There was still a lot to figure out, a lot of hurt that hadn't been healed, but we were trying. And that was more than I could have said a week ago. The next morning, I woke up before Emily and went straight to my office. The book was still sitting there, the pages waiting for me. I stared at the screen, my fingers hovering over the keyboard, but I couldn't bring myself to start writing again. Not yet. The story had changed. My story had changed, and I wasn't sure what to do with that. I sat there for a long time, thinking about everything we had talked about the day before, thinking about what it meant for us, for me. And then I realized something. The book didn't need to be a revenge story anymore. It didn't need to be about anger or betrayal or getting even. It could be about something else, something bigger. Maybe this story wasn't about her at all. Maybe it was about me, about how I had let my failures consume me, about how I had pushed away the people who mattered most to me. Maybe it was about finding a way to rebuild, even after everything had fallen apart. I closed the manuscript and started a new document. The words didn't come as easily this time, but that was okay. I wasn't in a rush. I was going to take my time with this one. Because this story wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about forgiveness, real forgiveness, the kind that starts with understanding yourself before you can understand anyone else. As I sat there typing out the first few lines, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time: hope. It wasn't much, just a flicker, but it was enough to keep me going. A few days passed, and things between Emily and me stayed tentative. We were careful with each other, both of us aware of how fragile everything was. But the distance between us was starting to close, little by little. We ate meals together, talked about things that weren't heavy or complicated. For the first time in months, it felt like we were moving forward, even if it was slow. But then, out of nowhere, the email came. It was from my publisher, excited about the manuscript I had turned in months ago, the one I had been avoiding since the affair. They loved it. They wanted to move forward with publishing. The timing couldn't have been worse. The email sat in my inbox like a ticking time bomb. My publisher's words were enthusiastic, filled with praise for the manuscript I had written during the darkest time of my life. "This is your best work yet," they said. "Raw, powerful, honest. We can't wait to get this out into the world." I stared at the screen, my stomach churning. The manuscript wasn't something I was proud of anymore. It was filled with anger, bitterness, and pain, a reflection of everything I had been feeling when I thought my world was falling apart. And now, after everything Emily and I had talked about, it felt like a different person had written it. But the problem was, it was good. I knew that. My publisher knew that. And if I were to release it, there was no doubt it would be a success. It would probably revive my career in a way that nothing else had. But at what cost? The manuscript was deeply personal, even if it was fiction. Anyone who read it would see the parallels between my protagonist's story and my own life. They'd see the anger, the betrayal, the need for revenge. They'd see everything I had gone through. And more importantly, they'd see everything Emily had done. I could imagine it now. The public praise for my honesty, the interviews where I'd be asked how much of the book was based on real events, the inevitable gossip about whether or not my wife was the inspiration for the story's villain. It would tear us apart. I knew that much for sure. I closed the email and leaned back in my chair, rubbing my temples as the weight of the decision pressed down on me. The old me, the one who had written that manuscript, would have sent it off in a heartbeat. He wouldn't have cared about the fallout, wouldn't have worried about how it might hurt Emily or anyone else. But I wasn't that person anymore. Not after everything that had happened. Not after the conversations Emily and I had had, the tentative steps we were taking to rebuild our marriage. The truth was, I didn't need revenge anymore. I didn't want it. What I wanted was peace. Peace with myself, peace with Emily, peace with the choices we had made. But could I walk away from the manuscript? Could I turn down the one thing that could get my career back on track? I spent the rest of the day in a haze, my mind flipping back and forth between the possibilities. Part of me was tempted to just bury the manuscript, to never think about it again. But I knew that wasn't realistic. The publisher was expecting a response, and sooner or later, I'd have to make a decision. That evening, as Emily and I sat down to dinner, I couldn't keep the turmoil inside any longer. "I got an email from my publisher today," I said, my voice hesitant. Emily looked up from her plate, her expression cautious. "Oh, what did they say?" I took a deep breath, trying to figure out how to explain everything. "They want to publish the manuscript I was working on before everything." Her eyes widened slightly, and I could see the wheels turning in her mind. She knew what that manuscript was about. She knew it wasn't just some random piece of fiction. It was our story, twisted and dark, filled with all the things I hadn't been able to say to her at the time. I see, she said quietly, her gaze dropping to her plate. And what are you going to do? That was the million-dollar question, wasn't it? I had been trying to figure that out all day, and I still didn't have an answer. I don't know, I admitted. I know the book is good. It's probably the best thing I've written in years, but it's not who I am anymore. It's not what I want. Emily nodded slowly, her fingers playing with the edge of her napkin. You're afraid it'll open up old wounds. Yeah, I said, the word heavy with meaning. For both of us. For a long time, we sat there in silence, the weight of the conversation hanging between us. Finally, Emily spoke again, her voice soft but steady. I don't want to stand in the way of your career, Dom. If you think this book will help you get back on track, then I won't stop you. But, she hesitated, her eyes meeting mine. I also don't want us to go back to that place. We've worked hard to get here, to start rebuilding, and I'm scared that if the book comes out, everything we've tried to fix will fall apart. Her words hit me harder than I expected. She was right. We had spent weeks trying to put the pieces of our marriage back together, slowly, carefully. It hadn't been easy, and there was still a long way to go. But we were making progress, and the thought of undoing all of that for the sake of a book, it didn't sit right with me. I reached across the table and took her hand in mine, squeezing gently. I don't want to go back to that place either, I said. The book isn't worth losing you over. Emily's eyes filled with tears, and she gave me a small, grateful smile. Thank you, she whispered. The decision was made. I wasn't going to publish the manuscript. It wasn't an easy choice, but it was the right one. My career could wait. This, what Emily and I were building, was more important. Over the next few days, I drafted a response to my publisher, thanking them for their enthusiasm, but explaining that the manuscript wasn't ready for publication. I didn't go into detail. I didn't need to. All I knew was that the book, in its current form, didn't represent the person I was anymore. It wasn't who I wanted to be. And that was enough for now. The relief I felt after sending that email was immediate. For the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe again. The anger and bitterness I had been carrying around for so long were starting to fade, replaced by something softer, something more hopeful. Emily and I continued to work on our relationship, slowly but steadily. There were still difficult days when the trust we had lost felt like an impossible thing to regain, but we were both committed to trying, and that was enough for now. As for my writing, I started working on something new, something that wasn't based on my own life, but that still carried the lessons I had learned through this whole experience. It was a story about forgiveness, about healing, about finding a way forward even when everything seemed broken beyond repair. It wasn't easy. The words didn't come as quickly as they had with the first manuscript, and there were days when I doubted whether I could pull it off. But I kept going, because this time it wasn't about revenge or anger. It was about hope. It was about trying to create something good, something that reflected the person I wanted to become. In the end, that was all that mattered. One night, as Emily and I sat on the couch together watching a movie, she leaned her head against my shoulder and sighed contentedly. It was a simple moment, but it felt like progress. For the first time in a long time, it felt like we were okay. I'm proud of you, she said quietly, her voice soft in the darkness. I turned to look at her, surprised. For what? For choosing us, she said, for choosing to move forward instead of holding on to the past. I smiled, feeling a warmth spread through me. I'm proud of us, I corrected her. We both made that choice. And as I sat there, holding her hand, I realized that this moment of peace, of connection, was worth more than any book, any career, any success I could have ever imagined. We had both been broken, but we were healing. Slowly, steadily, we were finding our way back to each other. And that was more than enough.